Holy Father, my name is Chris O'Leary, and I'm a survivor of abuse by a priest. In the first version of this video message to you, I talked about what happened to me and some of what happened when I tried to get help from the Archdiocese of St. Louis. While those stories were terrible and involved neglect and the abuse of the abused, what I'm about to tell you is even worse. And when people talk about criminal activity and invoking the RICO statute that the federal government has in the United States, these stories make that a possibility, if not a reality. So to sum up, I was abused by Father Leroy Valentine in 1977, starting in the fall of 1977, going until at least Christmas of 1980, if not beyond that. In 2002, Father Valentine, it was revealed that Father Valentine was an abuser. He was named in the New York Times and then in the local papers. I came forward to the Circuit Attorney's Office, Jennifer Joyce, as well as the Archdiocese of St. Louis. I never heard back from the Circuit Attorney Jennifer Joyce's office. I assumed at the time, and for up until recently, because I just assumed there was a problem with the statute of limitations. But after recording my first message, the first part of this message, I sat down and thought and ended up watching the movie Spotlight. Coincidentally, it was on. And that made me wonder exactly what is going on, what went on, and it brought some things that I experienced and continue to experience into focus. And again, these are things that they're not just wrong, but they're criminal. But to sum up the things that I label the abuse of the abuse, and that it is just abuse, which is horrible enough. So in early March 2002, I also came forward to the Archdiocese of St. Louis. My abuse was perpetrated by Father Leroy Valentine, but it was also seen and known of by then Father and then, well, now Cardinal Timothy Dolan. The time I came forward in 2002, early March 2002, Cardinal Regali was in charge of St. Louis, and then Bishop Dolan was the vicar for priests in the Archdiocese of St. Louis. Lo and behold, Bishop Dolan was asked by Cardinal Regali to investigate the Father Valentine allegations, and I talked to Cardinal Dolan and Bishop Dolan. And surprise, surprise, he told me nothing happened. I also talked to a woman named Nancy, I believe her name was Nancy Brown. She was sold to me as an independent psychologist. It turned out that she was working as the assistance coordinator for the Archdiocese of St. Louis. She also told me that nothing happened, that I was just misinterpreting things. A few days later, Father Valentine resigned I think it was the 27th of March 2002, as a result of another person who came forward with an allegation against Father Valentine. I was never informed that Father Valentine resigned. Bishop Dolan didn't tell me that Father Valentine resigned. He didn't follow up with me to say, hey Chris, you know the allegations that you had about Father Valentine. Turns out you're not the only one who had those allegations. Bishop Dolan never called me back. It's very interesting, and it's inappropriate. It's misconduct that someone who was involved in the cover-up of the abuse by Father Leroy Valentine was allowed to investigate that abuse and claims of that abuse. And I'm not the only person who Cardinal Dolan turned a blind eye to. I came forward in 2018, as I'll talk about in a little bit, and later on the day when I came forward, when the article ran, someone sent me a direct message via Twitter relaying a very similar story to mine. It's hard for me to explain just how deeply that affects me, that Cardinal Dolan knew what was going on, at least some of what was going on, some of what Father Valentine was doing to me, to him, to us, to others, and simply turned a blind eye to it. And it's immeasurably worse to know that now Cardinal Dolan, in late March 2002, knew that there were 6, maybe 7 allegations against Father Valentine, and Cardinal Dolan still did nothing to contact me, to help me, to let me know, hey, you're not the only one with allegations against Father Valentine. And of course, Archbishop Regali, I'll talk about Carlson, or I've already talked about Carlson. Archbishop Regali was in charge of the Archdiocese of St. Louis at the same time. He knew that Father Leroy Valentine had resigned for cause, and he never made any effort to reach out to or try to identify other victims of Father Valentine. He just let him resign and just go away and live in a private residence. The same thing was done by Cardinal Burke when he took over with Bishop Rick Sticca working as his fixers. No call was made, no notice was put in the papers letting people know that Father Valentine had resigned. And it's horrible. In 2011, you've got misconduct by Deacon Phil Hangen and the review team, if not the review board of the Archdiocese of St. Louis. In that meeting on May 9th, 2011, Deacon Hangen and everyone else who was there, I believe Deacon Hangen said it. I know the lawyers and the psychologist who was there said it. They told me they had no record of my conversations, of my 2002 conversations with Cardinal Dolan or with Nancy Brown, with the psychologist who I assume was Nancy Brown. I don't know whether they were lying or not. I suspect they were lying, or I suspect that some of the people in that meeting, including Deacon Phil Hangen, knew of my conversations with Cardinal Dolan and with Nancy Brown from 2002. But they told me that they had no knowledge of those conversations. And that's just gaslighting. When people talk about gaslighting, that's exactly what they're talking about. And that was a very devastating experience. What was even worse was what happened in May 2013. Again, this isn't criminal, but this is terrible. I haven't gotten to the criminal stuff yet. So in May 2013, Father Leroy Valentine was permanently removed by the Archdiocese of St. Louis. I was never notified, warned, offered assistance. They never let me know that they were permanently removing him. Nobody ever contacted me. They just did it and they announced it in the St. Louis papers. My psychologist had to let me know that Father Valentine was being permanently removed, and she understood that it was going to have a dramatic impact on me, which it did. But the Archdiocese couldn't be bothered to notify me of that fact, which just absolutely devastated and destroyed me. And when you talk about the abuse of the abuse, and talked about being tormented and tortured, that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about when I talk about the abuse of the abused. And what's worse, in the notice letting the people of St. Louis know that Father Valentine was being permanently removed, Deacon Phil Hangen, who wrote the notice, said that Valentine was being removed due to an allegation that had been received during the summer of 2012. And that absolutely drove me crazy, because I came forward in May 2011. So who else came forward with an allegation against Valentine? Who came forward in the summer of 2012? And selfishly, but reasonably, why wasn't I believed? Why did you believe the person who came forward in the summer of 2012? Or why did the Archdiocese of St. Louis believe the person who came forward in the summer of 2012? And they didn't believe me. That was just absolutely devastating. And it really destroyed me for a period of about 2 years or so. And I suspect that destruction was deliberate. I'm pretty sure that's not a criminal act, but when you start talking about RICO and the federal government's role in the investigation of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, this is when RICO and criminal activity starts to become relevant. Because this is starting to look like a conspiracy to silence survivors and to manipulate the statute of limitations, to deny survivors justice. And I'm hearing similar stories coming out of other parts of the country. It's as if people are running playbook. People in different dioceses are running plays from the same playbook. And that's where you start talking about RICO. And that's where you start talking about criminality. One thing that sure sounds like criminality to me is what happened in January 2014. In January 2014, the Archdiocese of St. Louis was involved in, I believe, in civil litigation, and under court order, the Archdiocese of St. Louis was ordered to produce a list of allegations they had received during a certain time frame. That time frame included at least 2002, if not 2011, when I came forward. Well, 2002, when I came forward to Cardinal Dolan. The Archdiocese said they lost that, but then I told the Archdiocese again on May 9th, 2011, of my conversations with Cardinal Dolan and the fact that I had brought allegations in early March 2002. So perhaps Cardinal Dolan hid my existence from the Archdiocese of St. Louis and didn't know about my 2002 conversations, as they said in the May 2011 meeting. But as of May 9th, 2011, the Archdiocese of St. Louis was aware of my allegations against Father Leroy Valentine. 3 years later, in early January 2014, when they produced the matrix, the Archdiocese of St. Louis did not include my allegation in the matrix. And I've subsequently found that that's true of at least one other person, if not two. I believe that's a criminal act. That sounds to me like perjury, and it also sounds like obstruction of justice. And that's where the movie Spotlight comes in, and what I saw last night and what I paid attention to last night, and that's also where the investigation of the Archdiocese of St. Louis by the Missouri Attorney General, first Josh Hawley and then Eric Schmidt, becomes relevant. Because I am starting to wonder if ever since the investigation of Archdiocese of St. Louis by the Missouri Attorney General was announced, I was suspicious about it. And I contacted the Missouri Attorney General's office, which was then run by Josh Hawley, multiple times just to make sure they knew who I was and that, you know, I had very powerful testimony. It's 5 months later. I've never been contacted by the Missouri Attorney General's office. They contacted me right before the election to say, oh yeah, we want to talk to you. Could you send us the timeline that you talked about? You know, we want to talk to you. We just don't want to talk to you right now, or we can't talk to you right now. But I still have yet to be contacted. When the Missouri Attorney General's office transitioned from Josh Hawley to Eric Schmidt, I was initially hopeful that things were going to get better, that they were going to be more organized, that I was going to be contacted, but that hasn't happened. And actually, things have actually gotten worse. They won't even, the Missouri Attorney General, the office of Eric Schmidt, will not return my phone calls asking for a status update, asking, you know, when are you guys going to interview me? And I've even been on the receiving end of harassment by a family member of one of the high-ranking members of the office of the Missouri Attorney General. Not Eric Schmidt, but someone high up within his office. One of those family members came after me a few weeks ago. And again, I don't understand the purpose of that or why they would do that, but it's made me question the validity of the Missouri Attorney General's investigation of the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And based on what I saw and heard from the movie Spotlight, I'm starting to wonder if there's some sort of coordination or organized campaign between the Missouri Attorney General's office and the Archdiocese of St. Louis to have the Missouri Attorney General back off of the investigation. I don't know that for a fact, but that's just how it feels. That seems to be what's going on. And I know that in the movie Spotlight, they talk about pressure being applied to law enforcement and other agencies to back off. Now, some of that was done on their own. These agencies, being populated or run by good Catholics, decided it was their responsibility to protect the church. I don't know what's going on, but I will tell you that something is going on with the Missouri Attorney General's investigation of the Archdiocese of St. Louis. Nothing's happening. Nobody will call me back. I saw a piece that they're collecting phone numbers, but again, what's the point of collecting phone numbers if you're not going to investigate witnesses? And I suspect there's some level of coordination, or at a minimum, the Missouri Attorney General, Eric Schmidt, is doing explicitly or implicitly doing the Archdiocese of St. Louis a favor in the investigation. And that's criminal. And that's, when you start talking about that, you're starting to talk about, again, you're starting to talk about RICO. The other things that I've observed that start to blur the line between terrible and horrific and criminal happened when I came forward in early 2018. I started to, with the death of Cardinal Dolan in late 2017, I started an effort, a social media campaign, to make people aware of the abuse of the abused and what it was like for people to be a survivor. And I made a number of attempts to contact the press, ended up contacting Aisha Sultan, who's a columnist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and also has a syndicated column. We started talking in early January, or in late January, early February of 2018 or so. At the same time, I was asking Sandra Price of the Archdiocese of St. Louis what was going on, and I was also trying to contact the USCCB, the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops, to let them know of the abuse of the abused, of the fact that the Assistance Coordinator program was a sham, that I had never been contacted by, told of the existence of an Assistance Coordinator by the Archdiocese of St. Louis. I received a letter from Sandra Price, Director of the Office of Child and Youth Protection of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, an email actually, and in that letter it essentially admitted that it happened. But the problem was that it admitted it happened in the midst of a number of lies, which I indicate in my copy of the letter. They lied about who said what, when, and what was said. And she said, your claims were acknowledged, which is legalistic language and really doesn't mean anything. It wasn't until 10 days later, literally, that I realized that when she signed off the letter, she said, you and all victims of abuse are in my prayers. That's the first time anyone associated with the Archdiocese of St. Louis had ever told me it happened, or had come close to admitting that it happened. When I tried to follow up with Sandra Price, and also tried to let a contact that I had at the USCCB, Deacon Bernie, know of the problems that I was having and that I had getting help from the Archdiocese of St. Louis, someone at the Archdiocese of St. Louis contacted the Shrewsbury police and told them that I had made terroristic threats against the Archdiocese of St. Louis. That's false. And I don't know whether that falls into the realm of filing a false police report, perjury, providing false evidence, but what happened was I sent an email to, I believe I sent it to Deacon Bernie and CC'd Sandra Price. And then the next day, 2 detectives from the Shrewsbury Police Department showed up at my door, and we ended up talking for an hour and a half. And they had it. I didn't know exactly what they were accusing me of, or what they were afraid of, but I got the sense that they were afraid that I was going to perpetrate a mass shooting. And I had no intention of that, have never had that. And to get back into the realm of stuff that's horrible, I do struggle with PTSD. And I have had, prior to my getting on antidepressant medications, I had problems with rage that I believe are related to PTSD. First in 2008, that just absolutely scared the crap out of me. And it's one reason why I don't leave the house. Because I've basically, in order to manage the PTSD, to protect myself and to protect other people, I don't leave the house. Because I never know when one of those attacks is going to come upon me. Now, it's true that since I've been on the antidepressants, thanks to Obamacare, not the Archdiocese of St. Louis, I haven't had anything close to the severity of the attacks that I've had. The PTSD attacks that I had in 2008 and have had a couple times since then. So things are getting better, and I'm less worried I was never worried about what I was going to do. I would rather kill myself than kill anyone else. And I've actually come up with plans regarding that. As I said, I was fighting cancer at the same time I was fighting the Archdiocese of St. Louis, and I've got literally the scars to prove it. They gave me medication during the recovery for that, and medication that I wasn't able to take, I believe because Father Valentine drugged me when he raped me. Either drugged me or plied me with alcohol, something like that. So I've got a bunch of Vicodin, and the plan was, if I ever got to the point where I'm killing someone else, I would kill myself. Thank God, never had to do that. I've been in therapy for a few months, which makes things easier. And I've been on an antidepressant for a couple of years, which also kills my sex drive. I'm essentially chemically castrated, but again, that helps. I mean, as horrible as that is, it actually helps because my sex drive and the abuse are intertwined. But it was diabolical for Sandra Price or whoever at the Archdiocese of St. Louis it was who made the allegation to accuse me of threatening a mass shooting, of making a terroristic threat against the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And it was obviously hugely triggering, given that I had some concerns about that a few years ago that turned out to be PTSD and complex PTSD. It's a terrible thing to accuse someone of. And if it's not criminal, it's literally diabolical. That wasn't the only time that happened. About a month later, I sent another email. I believe I sent it to Deacon Bernie again, trying to let him know, trying to blow the whistle on the Archdiocese of St. Louis, let him know what was going on. I was also emailing Cardinal Sean and Father James Martin and anyone who I could think of, trying to let them know, let people know what was going on in the Archdiocese of St. Louis, that the whole assistance coordinator program was a sham. And I was trying to let the USCCB know that the assistance coordinator was a sham, that the assistant coordinator promise and program was a sham. I figured USCCB would want to know because they're the ones who made the promise, and they would want to know that the Archdiocese of St. Louis wasn't living up to that promise. But both the first time I sent that email and the second time I sent that email, the Archdiocese of St. Louis, someone at the Archdiocese of St. Louis called the police. First it was Shrewsbury, the detectives. The second time was Webster Groves. These were just patrol cops, and they said that someone had called them worried that I was going to hurt myself or someone else. I wasn't. Again, all I was trying to do was blow the whistle on the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And thank God they didn't call it a terroristic threat like they did the first time when they called Shrewsbury, but to threaten me of threatening to kill myself or kill someone else is not it's not something you do to someone who's dealing with PTSD, complex PTSD, anxiety, depression. If you want to really ruin a survivor, call the police on them multiple times and make bogus allegations of terroristic threats and threatening to harm themselves or someone else. So I was working with Aisha Sultan during the whole spring of, kind of late winter, spring of 2018. In late April 2018, the piece ran in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Aisha Sultan's piece ran. Basically just telling my story, coming out, letting people know what was going on. I went public to Aisha Sultan. Later on that day, I was contacted by the person that I referenced before, who sent me a DM that I've posted before, but I'll post it again now, that talked about how Cardinal Dolan saw what was at least grooming behavior. I believe in my case it was actually abusive behavior, groping, up in Father Valentine's room. Cardinal Dolan, then Father Dolan, knew that Father Valentine was taking boys up to his room, and Father Dolan saw it and did nothing about it. another absolutely horrible thing that the Archdiocese of St. Louis did, I believe in an effort to discredit me and also to psychologically isolate me from my parish, which sadly was successful. I'm being shunned by my parish, former parish. In the article that Aisha Sultan put together, in which I came forward, an archdiocesan spokesman accused me of lying, accused me of changing my story. These are the exact words that the Archdiocese said in response to my coming forward. The problem with that statement that the Archdiocese of St. Louis made is it doesn't make logical sense. How can they say that my story changed if, as they told me on May 9th, 2011, they had no record of my conversations with Cardinal Dolan and Nancy Brown, the psychologist who I assume was Nancy Brown, that took place in 2002? It doesn't make logical sense. In order to say that something changed, to say that someone's story changed, you have to have 2 data points. And according to the Archdiocese of St. Louis, what they told me in the May 9th, 2011 meeting was they had no knowledge of my conversations, my March 2002 conversations with Cardinal Dolan or with Nancy Brown. They only had 1 data point. In order to say that something has changed, you have to have 2 data points. It's just basic logic. You can't say or determine that something changed based off of 1 data point. It's completely illogical. While that's not necessarily criminal, it's at a minimum immoral and contrary to the guidelines set forward by the USCCB. But, whatever. So to sum up, my message to you, Holy Father, is that the scope of the Sex Abuse Summit that's to take place in Rome in February, it can't just be the abuse of children. The abuse of children is a terrible thing, and it's a problem that needs to be solved. But as I've said in the first part of this message, the problem largely has been solved. Protecting God's children is working. The problem is within the hierarchy. The hierarchy remains the place where allegations go to die. And you've also got the problem of the response to survivors by the Archdiocese of St. Louis. The response to survivors is a sham. It's a fraud. It's good, it sounds great, it makes great PR, but it's a fraud. It's not, there's no there. And that, the abuse of the abused, torment under the guise of treatment, torturing survivors, is what needs to be addressed and the problem that needs to be solved at the February 2019 meeting, the Abuse Summit that is to take place in Rome. I believe you have the best intentions. I believe you're trying to do the right thing. But I do not believe that you understand what the problem really is. The problem is the abuse of the abused. And until I see something coming out of Rome, I will be respectful and I will appreciate everything that you say and you do, but I will remain skeptical. And to sum up, I'll use a phrase that my state, the state of Missouri, is known for. Talk is cheap. It's easy to talk. Show me.